What's up? Okay, so yeah, what we want to do here, folks, is kind of go through the entirety of the Cold War just to make sure that we know what we need to know. In the Alberta curriculum, there's some very specific terms that they suggest you need to know, and we see those in question number 1, where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know, 12 or so terms that we should know for the Cold War. So number 1 says, define the following terms, give an example. We're going to try to do this as quickly as possible. So the Cold War, number 1A. What was the Cold War? An ideological battle between the United States and the USSR from 1945, right, the end of World War II, all the way up until 1991. And of course, guys, it was a battle for ideological dominance, right? From the Second World War, we have 2 superpowers who are fighting to be number 1, right? And that's what the Cold War is all about. It is a war of prestige, and we see it, military race, the race for the nuke, the space race, which we didn't mention, but if you've ever watched the movie Apollo 13, you know that there was a race to the moon, right? The Soviets were the first country to put a cosmonaut in space, and then America one-ups them and puts someone on the moon and goes bleh, and sticks a American flag right there in the moon. Cool, right? All right, number 2, the second one, collective security. What is that? Best example we have of collective security in the Cold War is the use of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, right? So NATO was an example of collective security with Canada, the United States, and other Western European nations. And then the Warsaw Pact in 1955, right? NATO was 1949. But in 1955, the Warsaw Pact is formed as a response to NATO, and that involved the Soviet Union and also their nations behind the Iron Curtain, which we call those nations like Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, East Germany. We call those satellite states, right? We call them satellite states. Yeah, and the whole point here, guys, for NATO and the Warsaw Pact was that if one nation gets attacked by any other nation, they all collectively respond and repel that attack. Now, letter C, expansionism. Expansionism, we see that as far as the foreign policy and the dealings that we see in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union expanded into the nations of Eastern and Central Europe, and then their ideology expanded, right, communism, into China, and then we see it try to expand with North Korea invading South Korea. So expansionism is where you try to grow the ideological reach, or oddly enough, sphere of influence of your nation. We see that term in letter J, and we'll get to that. So expansionism is where you try to expand your ideological reach. D, containment. I mentioned as we're going through all the PowerPoints, containment, best example of it is the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. And basically, guys, containment is the dominant American foreign policy during the Cold War, right? It becomes articulated when Truman says we will help any nation turning its back on communism, and then America actually puts their money where their mouth is and pumps $17 billion into the former war-torn economy of Europe after World War II to help them rebuild so they don't turn towards communism. So containment, right? America's foreign policy during the Cold War. Why did they get involved in North Korea or in the Korean War? Containment. Vietnam, containment. Afghanistan, containment. Everything America does during the Cold War is to contain or stop the spread or expansion of the Soviet sphere of influence. E, deterrence. Best example we have of deterrence, when something's a deterrent, it prevents you from doing something, right? So because I don't want to go to jail, it is a deterrent for me breaking laws. And that's tough for a Millwoods boy like me. Now, great example of deterrence we see in the Cold War is this example of mutual assured destruction, or MAD, that acronym that talked about how neither side would attack the other because they knew if they did, their destruction would be imminent or mutually assured. And unfortunately, during the Cold War, that was probably the razor's edge that kept one side from attacking the other. Because if you launch nukes, let's say from America, and they're heading across to the USSR, the USSR would have about 30 minutes to see that those ICBMs are traveling, and then they would just fire them back. And hence, both sides lose. Brinkmanship. Best example of brinkmanship we have the Cold War would be the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? For those 13 days in 1962, we have the world pushed to the brink of nuclear war. Brinkmanship is a continual one-upping of tensions during the Cold War, and that played out in the 1960s. So Cuban Missile Crisis pushed us to the brink of nuclear war, right? I mentioned in the summaries of the chapters that the U.S. went to what is called Defense Condition 2 or DEFCON 2. That means the nuclear silos are ready, the keys are in the missile silos, and they're just waiting for the order to just hit those buttons and say peace to the world, right? Thankfully, it never came to that, and diplomacy was the order of the day. All right, liberation movements. What are we talking about here? Best example of liberation movements, I would argue, are the movement for freedom, or the movements from freedom or for freedom that we see from in 1953 East Germany, in 1953 Poland, and then in 1956 Hungary. All these nations wanted to be liberated from the Soviet sphere of influence. They did not want to be behind the Iron Curtain. And unfortunately, all these liberation movements ultimately fail. Why? Well, Cold War is war prestige, and you can't look weak to your ideological enemy. If you let other nations break free, then the rest of the nations might want to try to get out of there as well, right? So the USSR holds on to it. And of course, we see that idea of holding on to the empire with the Brezhnev doctrine, where Brezhnev says if any socialist nation tries to break free from the Soviet Union, they'll crush it, right? They'll crush it. Letter I, ideological conflict. Ideological conflict, guys, is the idea of, I mean, basically it's the Cold War, right? It is Western liberal democratic capitalism versus totalitarian communism. The greatest example of ideological conflict would be the Cold War itself. So that one's pretty easy. Letter J, sphere of influence. It's the idea that you want to expand your ideological reach across the globe as much as you can. So if you're America, you want to paint the world red, white, and blue, right? You want to make the entire world, right, the globe being a sphere, you want to have that entire globe become liberal and democratic and capitalist and believe in what America believes in, right? Join their ideological camp. If you are the Soviets, you want to paint the world red, right? And have everyone walking around with hammers and sickles, right? And you are trying to have the sphere that is the earth become influenced by your ideological belief system. And then lastly, number 1K, proxy wars. Let's talk about this. So the word proxy means when someone does something for you. So a proxy war is where, not specifically during the Cold War, did the US or the USSR ever actually fight each other directly. They had what we call proxies fighting for them. So the first example, guys, of a proxy war that we get during the Cold War is the Korean War. The Korean War was a UN-backed American force in Korea, and then it was the North Koreans fighting as a proxy for the Soviets, representing communism, right? And then, of course, we also see China backing them as well. So again, in North Korea, it was Americans versus Koreans, not Americans versus Soviets, but the Koreans represented the Soviet system. Second proxy war, of course, is Vietnam. That's where America, to stop the dominoes from falling over, right? That's where America goes to Vietnam. And we have American troops on the ground, and then Viet Minh, also known as Viet Cong soldiers, right, backed by Ho Chi Minh, or led by Ho Chi Minh, fighting against the United States of America, backed once again by the Chinese and also the Soviets. And then the last proxy war, the one we didn't really get into a lot of detail about, but if you want more detail, you can check out Rambo 3. If you haven't seen that movie, it is brilliant. Honestly, one of my favorite movies. So the third proxy war that we get in the Cold War is the war in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviets, they invade the nation of Afghanistan to try to prop up a failing Marxist government. Again, it's the Cold War, war of prestige. You can't let your sphere of influence get smaller. And once America sees this happen, what happens is they arm Afghani soldiers that we call the Mujahideen, and they fight against the Soviets. So it was Mujahideen fighters representing the American sphere of influence and like representing America fighting against Soviets who were directly on the ground. So in two of the proxy wars, we have American boots on the ground, and in one of them we have Soviet boots on the ground, but never did they actually fight directly against each other. All right, so that is the first set of questions. I'm just going to take a breath here. Whew. Okay, and let's move on to the next question. So really quickly, guys, explain the significance of the Potsdam Conference. Which nations represented there? How is it significant? Okay, Potsdam Conference. This is the conference held in Germany, Potsdam, Germany, at the end of World War II after the Nazis are defeated. It is Churchill and Truman representing the United States of America, and then it is Stalin representing the Soviet Union. At Potsdam, basically, the Truman and Churchill, right, the Western Allies want Germany to have free, open, fair elections. They want that for basically all of Europe. And Stalin wants a buffer zone between the West and the Soviet Union. There's a whole lot of Europe between the West and the Soviet Union. Stalin wants a buffer zone. And at this conference, Germany is divided into East and West Germany. And of course, West Germany is American, French, and British. And then East Germany is Soviet controlled, and then the city of Berlin is also subdivided into a West Berlin and an East Berlin. East Berlin is Soviet, and then West Berlin is American, French, and British. So it's significant because this is sort of the beginning of the hostilities that we see during the Cold War. Potsdam basically settles nothing, and ironically enough, a lot of people consider the demolishing of the Berlin Wall, right, in 1989 as sort of the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Okay, number 3, explain how the Truman Doctrine is seen as a type of containment. What was attempting to be contained by the U.S. Truman Doctrine, guys, I said this before, I'll say it again. It is the articulation of the American ideal of containment. We will help any nation turning its back on communism, right? They wanted to make sure, excuse my phone, they wanted to make sure that the ideology of communism didn't spread anymore. They had saw that Stalin moved into Eastern and Central Europe. Now, with the nation of Turkey and Greece, or the nations of Turkey and Greece, look like they're failing, and Truman's like, we can't have them fall to communism as well. So what's attempted to be contained? It is like the attempted containment of the ideology of communism. They can't let it spread anymore. Now, number 4, explain how the Marshall Plan is seen as a type of containment. It's the actual money, right? It's America putting its money where its mouth is, helping rebuild the Soviet economy. The rationale behind it was when times are bad, like in in former Russia, prior to the Russian Revolution, when societies start to break down and people are stuck in terrible economic conditions. They're hungry, they're starving. That's rather redundant. They don't trust their government anymore. That generally leads to revolution happening. And in the post-war economy that was Europe after World War II, it looked like that was going to happen again. Now, the Soviet response to the Marshall Plan was basically the Berlin blockade, right? And that, of course, happens in 1949. So the Berlin blockade was where Stalin tried to basically force out France, Great Britain, and the United States out of the city of Berlin, right, in West Berlin. And that lasted for 15 months to the tune of 277,000 flights. The response of the Allies was, of course, the Berlin airlift to save the city of Berlin. After 15 months, we see Stalin give it up. First victory for the Western Allies in the Cold War. All right, number 6, explain how NATO, created in 1949, can be seen as collective security. Geographically, where were most nations of NATO located? Again, the idea of all for one for all, right? This is the Western world coming together to combat the awesome threat that is the Soviet Union. If one is attacked, we all respond. And geographically, most nations that were a member of NATO were actually in Western Europe. You just do a little bit of Googling, NATO nations, you'll see a nice map that shows you where those NATO nations were. And of course, guys, NATO was a response, like I said, to the threat that was the Soviet Union and its awesome might of the Red Army. Now, Soviet response number 7, Warsaw Pact, right? And this involved the nation of the Soviet Union and all of its satellite states behind the Iron Curtain. So NATO and Warsaw Pact represent this idea of collective security. Number 8, during the Cold War, deterrence was an important tool used by both sides. Explain the connection between deterrence and mutually assured destruction. The threat of being annihilated by nuclear weapons was a strong deterrent against the idea of a nuclear first strike. So because both nations knew that if they attacked the other, it would lead to their mutual destruction, they were deterred from ever starting a first strike. Now, number 9, the classic example of brinkmanship is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Explain this crisis in terms of the following. Why did Cuba turn towards the USSR for help after their socialist revolution? Cuba turned towards the Soviet Union. It was Castro going to Khrushchev because of the fact that America tried to assassinate Fidel Castro and basically crush the Cuban Revolution, right? That communist revolution seen in America's backyard in something called, and you should know this, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion was an absolute catastrophe, but what it taught Castro was that there was a bullseye on his back, a bright red, white, and blue bullseye. America was coming for him, and that just pushed Castro logically to whoever hated the United States. And the big player hating the US, of course, was the Soviet Union. Now, why was America threatened by Cuba being communist? Because America believed in containment, right? And again, I mentioned this before, when communism was in China or in North Korea or in Vietnam, that wasn't cool, right? But still, that was on the other side of the world. Now, literally a communist nation in America's backyard, that was inconceivable in the eyes of the United States of America. Now, letter C, how did the Bay of Pigs invasion escalate tensions between the US and the USSR and Cuba? Again, logically, I mean, if I was Fidel Castro and the US just tried to stop my revolution and oust me from power and kill me, I wouldn't be too happy either. So no kidding. And Khrushchev's response was, hey, you hate America? So do we, right? So let's do this. The term they use in the video is throw a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants. And that hedgehog is in the form of missiles, which are nuclear tipped. Now, D says when ballistic missiles were detected by Cuba, or in Cuba by U.S. forces, supplied by the USSR, what was the response of President Kennedy? America's response to missiles heading towards Cuba and on Cuba was a military blockade of the island of Cuba, right? They started a blockade of the island of Cuba. In the end, diplomacy is the order of the day. 10th day into the Cuban Missile Crisis, there is a cable, right? A message sent from Khrushchev to Kennedy basically saying, look, we need to untie this knot of war because eventually if we keep pulling on the knot, we're not going to be able to get it undone. And basically the USSR agrees to remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for America removing missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. So it's kind of a win-win for everyone. And of course, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. People were tired of the threat of constant nuclear annihilation. Living during those 13 days, and I wasn't even close to being alive at that time, but would have been incredibly tense. This is when people were practicing in schools things like duck and cover drills, right? Where, you know, if your teacher blew the whistle or if there was an announcement over the school's intercom system, right, they would get underneath their desks and it would be like a mock drill should the Soviets launch a first strike against the United States or even in Canada, right? Kids in Canada were practicing duck and cover drills as well. Explain the term ping pong diplomacy, number 10, and how it helped ease tensions between the ideological enemies. Oddly enough, ping pong was sort of the game that united the United States and China, right? America got an invite from China to bring a ping pong coalition along with American media to that country. A few months after that, Richard Nixon goes to China, meets with Chairman Mao. They wine, they dine. He watches gymnastics. He watches ping pong again. And we have goodwill. This is happening in the early 1970s during the so-called Detente era. So yay for ping pong. Number 11, proxy wars. Talked about it. 3 proxy wars of the Cold War. Number 1, Korean War. Number 2, Vietnam. And then number 3, Afghanistan. Never did the sides fight directly against each other. They always had one of the superpowers have a proxy fighting for them. In the case of North Korea and Vietnam, it was American boots on the ground, and then Soviet proxies. In the case of Afghanistan, it was Soviet boots on the ground, and then an American proxy. Number 12. What was the Berlin Wall intended to do on the part of the USSR? How was the fall of the Berlin Wall significant when it comes to the Cold War? The Berlin Wall was to stop the brain drain that was happening from from East Berlin to West Berlin, right? Once you went from East Berlin, which was communist controlled, to West Berlin, which was free, you could get the heck out of East Germany, right? And get to West Germany and then anywhere in the world. So this was a crisis for the Soviet Union. This made them look bad. If the Soviet Union really was a utopia, like it was supposed to be, right? If the nations behind the Iron Curtain were actually supposed to be, or a utopia like they're supposed to be, then why would people be leaving? And don't forget, guys, too, Marx, right? Marxism was a German export. Karl Marx was a German. So the idea of communism was actually a German idea. Both Marx and Engels were German philosophers. So if Marxism can't prove its worth in Germany, then what good is the system? So the response of Nikita Khrushchev was to put up the Berlin Wall, 100 miles long, 12 feet high, 3-4 feet thick. And that wall stood until 1989. And of course, it went up in the 1960s. 1961 to be exact, right? So 1961, the wall goes up, and in 1989, it comes down. How's it significant when the wall falls? Well, again, a lot of historians consider the falling of bringing down of the wall, which, by the way, I watched live on TV. Shout out CNN. Fake news. The Berlin Wall, when it came down, it kind of signified the end of Soviet prestige, right? Like that wall was a definite dividing line between the free world and the Soviet controlled world. So when that wall came down, it sort of represented the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. And then lastly, explain SALT 1, SALT 2. As examples of detente, what was the express purpose of SALT? SALT 1 and 2, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. These were signed during the era of detente. SALT 1 was signed by Brezhnev and Nixon. SALT 2 was signed by Gorbachev and George Herbert Walker Bush, the father of the man who was in charge, right? George W. Bush, during the 9/11 attacks, right? And a lot of you probably weren't alive then, but that's okay. So yeah, SALT 1, SALT 2 are examples, guys, of detente, as was the ABM, not mentioned in the question. But at this time, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was also signed as well. And that treaty, or these treaties, basically, they represent the lessening of nuclear tensions during the Cold War, which was good because the threat of nuclear annihilation was a pretty scary thing during the Cold War. All right, folks, that is it. Hopefully, you know a heck of a lot more about the Cold War. Next thing you should be doing is your exam. So good luck to you. If you know these questions, you should be good to go. If you've watched all the summary videos and the videos from Media Rich, you will know a ton. You should just fine on your exam. All right, love you guys. Peace. Take it easy. Sorry about this being long, but I had a lot to say. Take it easy, guys. Peace.